generic development and bridging global regulations, and FDA perspective. It's going to be presented by Dr. Sarah Ibrahim. She's Associate Director for Global Drug Affairs at the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research at the FDA. She has a PhD in pharmaceutics from the University of Cincinnati. Next slide, please. Hello, next slide, yes. We are the moderators for this webinar. Mr. Kaushik Desai and myself, we are on the executive committee of the International Pharmaceutical Society. Next slide. I have a few brief announcements to make. This webinar is being recorded and it is live streamed on YouTube. The recording is in English, but translations are available in Mandarin, Spanish, and Portuguese. This recording will be available on the FIP website. It will be available for a year. So you're welcome to go back and listen to it. The only thing that will not be available are the live Q&A. You may ask questions using the question box provided. You will see two boxes. One is a chat box. The other one is a Q&A box, question and answer box. For questions, please use the Q&A box. Please do not use the chat box. Chat box you can use to introduce yourself and greet others who are on this. You are welcome to provide feedback to the FIP. This will help us improve our webinars. We welcome all of you to become members of FIP, and there is a website that you can go to and register and become a member. Next slide, please. We would like to thank the US FDA for supporting this event by allowing Sarah to make this presentation. Next slide, please. I have a special announcement to make. That is, this year, the FIP Pharmacy Practice Research Special Interest Group will hold in-person meeting on July 4th and 5th at Utrecht University Applied Sciences in the Netherlands. All PhD students, supervisors, and researchers are invited to attend. The goal is to build global pharmacy network, present their research, increase pharmacy practice contributions to global health. The program will offer interactive workshops and keynote sessions. Please book your place and register by June 30th. Next slide, please. Okay, so I'm going to hand this over to Sarah and she will make a presentation.
Thank you so much, Matthew. Let me just first share the screen. And if you can kindly confirm that you can see the full screen presentation slide.
Yes.
Great, thank you so much. With that, all right, so thank you very much for having me today. And thank you for the kind introduction. It is my pleasure presenting to you. I am Sarah Ibrahim, the Associate Director of Global Generic Drug Affairs in the Office of Generic Drugs, Center for Drug Evaluation and Research at the United States Food and Drug Administration. We inaugurate today's presentation by stating that this presentation reflects the author's personal opinions and should not be construed to represent the FDA's views or practices. So the goal of this session today is to really present to you an overview of the Office of Generic Drugs Global Affairs program, particularly given the global nature of generic drug products, the impact of global engagements, and an in-depth look at the two most prominent international initiatives led by the Office of Generic Drugs, namely the Generic Drug Cluster and the Parallel Scientific Advice. Now, one of the FDA's public health priorities is assuring access to affordable, high-quality medications for the American public. And as an agency, we do acknowledge that generic drug competition promotes price reduction, consequently enhancing access to the American people. The FDA's generic drug program has continued its dedicated efforts to supporting the availability of more affordable, high-quality generic pharmaceuticals in the United States. And as pharmaceutical innovation continues to expand and evolve, we face a remarkable global challenge while maintaining our high standards and commitment to public health. So we always start our presentations with saying that the American public expect high quality, safe, and effective medicines. This expectation is an equivalent expectation for a brand and a generic. A generic medication is one that is therapeutically comparable to the innovator product, but does not require the repetition of the time-consuming and expensive animal and clinical trials. This enables generic drugs to be introduced to the market at a much faster pace and a much lower cost, improving public access to life-changing drugs. The agency and the generic drug program's main goals are to ensure the quality, safety, and efficacy of generic medications, and to ensure that approval is based on sound scientific and regulatory foundation. So the Drug Price Competition and Patent Term Restoration Act of 1984, commonly known as the Hatch-Waxman Amendments, introduced almost 4 decades ago, created the current generic drug approval pathway. Generic medications prior to that amendment accounted for about 19% of all prescription pharmaceuticals dispensed in the United States. Today, approximately 90% of prescriptions filled in the United States are generic medications. With due acknowledgement to FDA actions and rules enacted under the Hatch-Waxman Amendments, as well as the Generic Drug User Fee Amendments, or commonly known as GDUFA. Generic medications enhance patient access while lowering drug prices significantly. So to put this in perspective, currently brand name drugs account for just about 10% of prescriptions dispensed in the United States, but they account for over 80% of drug spending. The remaining 90% of prescriptions in the United States are filled using generic medications. OGD's strategic and proactive methods to generic drug development and assessment continue to have a significant impact for patients in the United States and, in fact, globally. This past year alone, the Generic Drug Program approved hundreds of abbreviated new drug applications and thousands of application supplements. Our office did prioritize the assessment of generic drug submissions for potential treatments and supportive therapies for patients with COVID-19, approving more than 75 original ANDAs, some in record time. And since the beginning of the pandemic, more than 1,200 supplements as well. We funded approximately $20 million in generic drug science and research programs. We issued 149 product-specific guidances for generic drug development, including 54 for harder to develop complex drugs, to relay the agency's thinking on the most appropriate methodology and evidence needed to support the development of specific generic drugs. Now in 2021, OGD's scientific and programmatic innovation supported our generic drug assessment work. For instance, we established the scientific foundation to support alternative bioequivalence approaches for several generic drug products. One such example included a novel in vitro bioequivalence approach that directly resulted in the development, assessment, and approval of the first generic difluprednate ophthalmic emulsion that is commonly known as the generic of Durezol, and it is used to treat eye swelling and pain after eye surgery. Another innovation came with this year's approval of the first generic paliperidone palmitate extended release injectable suspension, a long-acting injectable product indicated for the acute and maintenance treatment of schizophrenia in adults. The FDA developed modeling and simulation approaches for pharmacokinetic study designs and bioequivalence evaluations, which the applicant successfully used. In yet another example, we approved the first complex generic of pheromoxetol injection, a parenteral, non-oral iron product that treats iron deficiency anemia. Our scientific investment in the characterization of the product and advanced bioequivalence study designs was essential for this particular approval. OGD maintained its commitment to public health, and we do recognize how intricate and delicate the global pharmaceutical industry truly is. Now, OGD has long navigated that complex terrain. The worldwide generic medication industry is expected to grow by more than $180 billion in the next 10 years alone. Increased patent expirations, as well as policy and government measures aimed at lowering prescription costs, are likely to even boost the projected market growth. So as the US drug market shifted toward incentivizing reduction in generic drug costs, manufacturers relocated facilities overseas, particularly in developing regions of the world. This sweeping shift in manufacturing was highlighted in the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research's site catalog, which lists all drug manufacturing facilities worldwide that are subject to routine FDA inspections. Over the past 30 years, pharmaceutical manufacturing has become increasingly global, and this movement was further accelerated in the 2000s. And as of May 2020, 26% of facilities manufacturing APIs and 46% of facilities producing finished drug products for the US market were located in the United States. So the highly globalized pharmaceutical industry, and complicated with changes in policies and regulations, has resulted manufacturing of pharmaceuticals to become more of a global endeavor. It crosses numerous borders around the world before it eventually reaches the patients. Not only have those supply chains grown in complexity, but we do recognize that medications have also become increasingly complex. Navigating that complex global landscape and ensuring that US imports are manufactured according to the FDA's stringent regulatory requirements is a challenge, given that each of the 150 plus countries involved in the generic drug supply chain to the United States each have their own set of laws and regulations and standards. Now, regulatory agencies regulate extremely globalized supply chain under national regulations. And it comes at no surprise that regulatory agencies participate in a variety of bilateral and multilateral engagement activities in order to achieve a higher level of international cooperation, ensuring their national sovereignty. So FDA's 2011 report titled Pathway to Global Product Safety and Quality also noted that both China and India enjoy a labor cost advantage, and that manufacturing active pharmaceutical ingredients in such regions can reduce costs for US and European companies by an estimated of 30 to 40%. Now, according to the 2020 CDER site catalog, the top 5 countries by number of manufacturing sites were the United States, India, China, Germany, and Canada. According to an HHS published report, sources have estimated that between 40 and 65% of clinical trials investigating FDA-regulated products are in fact conducted outside the United States. So sponsors employ benefits from conducting clinical studies overseas due to lower costs in some countries, or possibly the capability of conducting larger trials in a significantly shorter time. It's without a doubt that globalization of generic drug development does compel a more harmonized generic drug development process and the convergence of technical requirements among different regulatory agencies. So the advancement of technology has resulted in more complicated pharmaceutical products. Now that, of course, provides an opportunity and a significant challenge as they approach patent expiration. Complex pharmaceuticals are distinguished based on the difficulties in assessing and establishing pharmaceutical equivalence and bioequivalence. Now, while the terminology may be different, we do agree that complex generics earned their title by the complexity of the development process. One of the commitments made by the FDA under GDUFA 2 in 2017 was to expedite the approval of complex generics. Now, to that end, the FDA created the PRE-ANDA program, which aims to clarify regulatory expectations for potential applicants early in product development, supporting a more efficient and effective ANDA review process. So as we progress from basic small molecules with well-established regulatory guidelines to more complex generics, the regulatory pathway needs to move towards that complexity as well. Encouraging generic competition for complex products does improve patient access, simultaneously lowering prescription costs. Well, FDA has been praised for its critical role in protecting the American public from unsafe and ineffective products. The FDA is well-resourced, we're conversant, highly competent, but we also recognize the value in cooperating and collaborating with other regulatory agencies to reduce duplication of efforts and improve coherent regulatory decision-making. We are committed to promoting global harmonization of scientific and technical standards for generic pharmaceutical development. The OGD Global Affairs program, which I lead, was created to establish a clear global policy and strategy for the increasing volume of pharmaceuticals manufactured globally. The necessity of having a clear global policy and strategy led to the establishment of the Global Affairs program within the Office of Generic Drugs. OGD recognizes the importance of its global presence, and the Office of Generic Drugs established a Global Affairs program to ensure a strong FDA voice and impact to promote high level of quality culture and standards. Now, we as an agency are truly honored to protect the American public and hold products intended to be used domestically to equal regulatory requirements, regardless of their source. We're proactively navigating the landscape in identifying emerging regulatory changes in numerous countries that we consider stakeholders based on the pharmaceutical supply chain. We're engaging proactively rather than reactively with our regulatory counterparts, as well as industry representatives, to facilitate FDA's domestic mission of assuring safety, efficacy, and quality of FDA-regulated products. Common standards for global development for generics can improve access to generic medicines. And ICH is truly uniquely positioned to develop harmonized recommendations thereby expanding that anticipated convergence. Now, global harmonization for generic drugs is not a new concept, and in fact dates back to 2001 WHO report. FDA strategically leveraged ICH reform initiated at the end of 2015 to propose generic drug initiatives and established a unique global affairs program in OGD at the end of 2015. The ICH Generic Drug Group, or commonly known as ICH GDG, was established back in 2019, following endorsements of the ICH reflection paper, Further Opportunities for Harmonization of Standards for Generics. The ICH GDG served as a technical discussion group for issues that are relevant to harmonization of the scientific and technical standards for generic drugs, and recommended areas for harmonization under ICH, and assesses the feasibility as well as the impact. Technical difficulties. It assesses the difficulties as well as the opportunities for those initiatives. They function to survey existing ICH as well as World Health Organization guidelines to assess gaps in guidances for generic drugs, and to also prioritize work areas and nominate recommendations to ICH. So let's go through some of the key proposals in the ICH reflection paper that really does outline the strategic approach for developing and enhancing ICH guidelines to support the harmonization of scientific and technical standards for generic drugs. These guidelines include tools for demonstrating equivalence or bioequivalence for non-complex dosage forms and more complex dosage forms and products. It proposed steps and recommendations for global harmonization of standards for generic drugs. The reflection paper recognizes that different regions have different regulatory frameworks. For example, the US Food and Drug Administration does not allow a generic drug and its reference product to be different oral dosage forms. In contrast, in the European Union, EMA does allow a generic drug and its reference product to be different oral dosage forms if the product meets bioequivalence criteria. Therefore, the reflection paper really focuses on harmonization. The reflection paper focuses on harmonizing scientific standards for bioequivalence that can be used within the existing regulatory framework. It further outlines issues related to more complex products currently on the horizon, such as modified release products, complex injectables, transdermals, topical dermatological, as well as inhalation products. The work of GDG paved the path for the development of the ICH M13 Expert Working Group, which formed in July of 2020 and represents the first topic since the ICH reorganization in 2016 that is specifically focused on the generic pharmaceutical industry. ICH M13, titled Bioequivalence for Immediate Release Solid Oral Dosage Forms, is the foundation for establishing the safety and efficacy of immediate release solid dose generics. And scientific harmonization of these study designs would, and I quote, allow the rationalization of some important aspects of the conduct of these trials and optimize product development. It was hailed and saluted by the global industry with the vision that bioequivalence studies worldwide can be conducted according to common expectations, increasing efficiency of the generic drug development process, increasing quality of generic drug development, and a crucial first step toward global development of generic products. So 2021 was a very significant year for OGD Global Affairs program, with the launch of two momentous initiatives, the generic drug cluster, as well as the parallel scientific advice. So FDA is involved with a number of partnerships and collaborations with regulatory counterparts designed to streamline procedures for bringing new products to market ambitiously in multiple regions. The FDA fosters partnerships with counterpart foreign government agencies and international organizations. The tools that FDA uses, such as confidentiality commitments, establish a legal framework for the FDA to share certain kinds of non-public information with FDA counterparts in foreign countries and international organizations. This does allow the FDA to collaborate in addressing potential public health concerns, offer better regulatory guidance in its review activities, and improves the agency's ability to perform its role in providing regulatory oversight. FDA engages in bilateral and multilateral clusters to work together on special topics and therapeutic areas identified as requiring intensified exchange of information and collaboration. So in June of 2021, OGD Global Affairs program launched the generic drug cluster. And by doing so, we were given a unique opportunity to increase the scientific alignment between the leading generic drug regulatory agencies, paving the path for understanding complications that occur during the life cycle of the product. It also allows us to determine the gaps needed to achieve regulatory convergence and coherence on a global level. It can be the predecessor to understand the shortcomings and limitations of generic drug regulatory harmonization. In establishing the generic drug cluster, we really did establish a unique platform for knowledge and information exchange on emerging and trending issues in such a critical time where product portfolios are becoming increasingly complex and the share of hard to make and specialized drugs going off patent are increasing. Now, the cluster is currently limited to government regulatory authorities, given the need for confidential information sharing. As I mentioned, 2021 was a very active year for global affairs, and the European Medicines Agency, or EMA, and the United States Food and Drug Administration, FDA, have established a pilot program to provide parallel scientific advice to applicants of marketing authorization applications for hybrid products and abbreviated new drug applications for complex generic drug products. Now, the PSA is really good news for industry. The PSA program provides a mechanism for both EMA and FDA to concurrently consider and jointly exchange with applicants the agency's views on scientific questions during the development phase of hybrid or complex generic products. Now, the PSA, or the Parallel Scientific Advice, officially launched in September of 2021 to increase the dialogue in an effort to achieve successful collaboration between the two agencies and applicants from the beginning of the life cycle of a hybrid or a complex generic drug product. It allows us to provide applicants with a deeper understanding of the basis of regulatory decisions, optimizing product development, and also avoid unnecessary replication of studies or unnecessary testing methodologies. Now, providing that necessary scientific advice early in the development stage allows for better designed studies to generate robust data. And given that the dialogue does occur between these two agencies, we can protect patients from unnecessary clinical studies that would fail to provide useful evidence if, in fact, pursued. The effective guided development allows optimal use of resources available and consequently access of patients to beneficial medications. So there are a couple of elements to know about the PSA program. So the PSA program is voluntary. And in order to participate in the PSA program, applicants submit requests to both EMA and the FDA. The PSA program focuses on sharing information and perspectives between applicants and both regulatory agencies. Now, candidates for the PSA program include product development programs that may benefit from the PSA process by potential harmonized approaches. For example, an applicant can use the PSA program to determine whether a study design might be acceptable to both regulatory agencies. Now, pursuing that program allows an applicant to have a clearer understanding of the agency's respective regulatory requirements and scientific recommendations regarding the development program discussed. Now, if the advice from two agencies is divergent, the applicant will have a clear understanding of the reasons for that divergence. So let's go through what the PSA process is. So requests for PSA meetings will be granted based on workload, availability of staff, but more importantly, the anticipated value to patients. For each request, agencies will hold one trilateral meeting with applicant focused on specific development issue raised. And enrolling in the PSA program is applicant driven. And what an applicant should focus on is developing scientific questions involving the development of a hybrid or a complex generic product for which the applicant desires to have further scientific input from both EMA as well as FDA. The PSA process is divided into 3 stages. So the first stage, or stage 1, is really the PSA meeting requests. And an applicant here is encouraged to focus on and develop scientific questions involving the development of a complex or a hybrid generic product for which the applicant desires to have further scientific input from both EMA and FDA. Submission does not guarantee that the PSA meeting will be granted, and only after an applicant's request for a PSA meeting is not granted that the applicant is then free to pursue a scientific advice procedure with each agency individually. In other words, you cannot submit a PSA request and a pre-ANDA request at the same time. Stage 2 is the meeting preparation and conduct stage. And this starts if both agencies agree and grant the applicant's PSA request. Applicants should then submit a draft meeting package to EMA and FDA, after which the applicant will participate in a trilateral PSA teleconference with EMA and FDA, which will usually be scheduled around 120 days after the applicant submits the full meeting package. Now, the final stage, or stage 3, is the post-meeting agency communication. After the PSA process, each agency will retain its individual regulatory decision-making regarding the drug development and marketing applications. The advice of each agency may, in fact, still differ after the joint discussion. Each agency will provide the applicant with independent advice on the questions posed during that PSA meeting, according to usual procedures and timelines of each agency. And participation in the PSA program should never be construed to ensure any particular action on a marketing application by either agency. And of course, as always, agencies will strive to provide PSA responses that are convergent, or at least explain the reasoning and the rationale for any differences that could occur. You know, I always like to end my presentations with us recognizing the challenges, but our opportunity for convergence and harmonization is now. And the path towards common standards for global development for generics can improve access for generic products with substantial healthcare savings. We do recognize that products with small markets may not be economically sustainable unless those markets can somehow be aggregated through such convergence efforts. And the massive investment in development of complex generics can be supported and cost mitigated by entrance into multiple parallel markets. And with that, I thank you, and I'm open to all questions.
Yes, Sarah. Excellent presentation. We have a few questions which I'll be taking up one by one. The first question is for generic drug development. Do we need to wait for the patent to expire and start working then, or what is best timeline to start working on the generic drug development without infringement of the patent?
So that's a very good legal question, and really the scientific development process is not as restricted with the patents. Patents are a restriction for approval and access to market. Typically, generic companies start the pharmaceutical development process much in advance to expiration of the patent.
Thank you, Zara. There's another question. In the FDA dissolution methods database, the media recommended therein are sufficient for a generic product to demonstrate in vitro equivalence, or these media are solely for quality control of batch-to-batch performance to guide industry and not to prove their equivalence?
It's a great question. So bioequivalence is really bioequivalence is addressed by the Office of Generic Drugs. Dissolution methodologies is addressed under the Division of Biopharmaceutics and Office of New Drug Products and Office of Pharmaceutical Quality. However, I will give you an umbrella response. And in the dissolution database, those are predominantly quality control methodologies, the biorelevance of which, or an ability to assess in vivo performance, may not be similar to what you would expect or what you would require from a quality control methodology. I hope that answers the question, that quality control assessments and biorelevant, as well as bridging, for example, they require different approaches.
Yes, thank you. What does bioequivalence studies include, and is it only used in generic drug approval and not in innovative product? If not, why?
Well, actually, bioequivalence requirements, you need to prove bioequivalence for your products in order to get approval for a generic drug. The concept of proving that a product is similar to another is used in innovative drug products as well, in certain elements such as approving a different dosage form, and that's not a generic. That would be considered a new drug application.
Okay, thank you. Here's another question. Definition of generic drug differ country to country.
Yes.
How formulation could be harmonized?
So I hope the talk today kind of answer that question. The pathway is long, and we know that. And it's one of the reasons why the OGD Global Affairs program is trying to strategically address the divergence regulatory requirements in many elements. We have the ICH pathway. We established a parallel scientific advice to kind of provide at least some level of bridge between agencies as well as industry. But also we have launched the generic drug cluster, which allows us as regulators to discuss far in advance to bringing those regulations to ICH consideration and harmonization. That does allow us to build bridges and what I would call like a prospective convergence efforts, so that we are working in the dialogue as we're developing those regulations, as we're moving forward. The path is long, but we're here. We started.
Okay, thank you. Why is Health Canada not a participant in the PSA program? There is a concern expressed on that.
Can you repeat the question again?
Why Health Canada is not a participant in PSA program?
Well, that's a great question. And Health Canada is a part of the generic drug cluster. So the dialogue is constant, and we've had bilateral coordinations and collaboration with Health Canada significantly for many years. The parallel scientific advice that is in the generic drug program now is actually a continuation of the parallel scientific advice that was initiated for the Office of New Drugs. And therefore, it was a collaboration initially launched between EMA and FDA. So there really was no reasoning behind it. It was because of a continuation program. So who launched and initiated have continued the program.
Thank you. Are PSA application response by the agency confidential, or are the responses to be a public record and available to all?
That's a great question. So the response through EMA and FDA to a PSA program, they are separate, and each agency follows their own requirements and regulations in their communication with the applicant. So it is very similar to how you would predict a pre-ANDA communication with the FDA would occur. It is not public, and it is confidential with industry. So consider that this is very similar to what a pre-ANDA is. However, it does include other agencies. Your correspondence from the FDA will come from the FDA, as all other communication with pre-ANDA meetings.
Okay, thank you. There's another question. Can you please describe about approaches for harmonization for narrow therapeutic index drug for BE studies? That is FDA's reference scale average, BE.
So that's a great question.
Yeah, and EMA AB approach. Which approach is better suitable?
So that's a great question. And I hope you are able to read the ICH reflection paper, where it really does outline the pathway that we have. So, we start off with non-complex dosage forms, and then we're moving towards more complex dosage forms with additional strength waivers for IR products. And, that's followed under the M13 guideline, but it goes down to where there's an annex series addendum that does discuss BE analysis for narrow therapeutic index. So there's more to come. ICH M13 is moving along, and it should be very soon. And you will hear more. Now, internally within the cluster dialogue between us and our other foreign regulators, the dialogue is constantly going, and we do discuss issues such as those mentioned. How do we define? How do we determine what agencies have what definitions, and how can we bridge those gaps between us? So the dialogue is ongoing.
Okay, thank you. Do we need to include particle size and bulk density acceptance criteria for compounds for developing formulation?
I missed the audio and parts of that question. Can you repeat the question again?
Yes, please. Do we need to include particle size and bulk density acceptance criteria for class 1 compounds for developing formulation? It's a very specific.
That's a great question. I would defer you to more of OPQ related requirements, and there are PSGs available. If your question is pertaining a general question, I would defer you to those guidances. If your question is pertaining a particular product, I do urge agencies to utilize the different communication methods with FDA. whether it's utilizing a controlled correspondence to get certain questions addressed. That's an excellent pathway to communicate with FDA and get a response to your questions. Or if it elevates to the level that requires, a pre-ANDA discussion, then that would be helpful. But I do defer your question to specific guidances, and I can share them with Matthew after this meeting.
Yeah, thank you. Can you please throw light on the fee structure for seeking PSA?
The structure of seeking a PSA program.
Yes.
Okay, so the first thing that I will do is that I will share with you, actually, in fact, can everyone visit the OGD Global Affairs program? So if you Google OGD Global Affairs program, you will see our anchor page. And in there, there's the parallel scientific advice. If you click on that link, it will take you to a stepwise process. It will even list the email communications that you need, because you will actually submit the parallel scientific advice request through 2 emails, one for the FDA and one for the EMA. On our webpage, it will guide you step by step. But as I mentioned, it is a 3-stage process. The first is submitting a request to EMA and FDA through the emails that are on our website. And then when you get approval from both FDA and EMA, prior to your approval, EMA and FDA are already discussing that PSA submission request. When you do get that approval, when you are approved into the PSA program, you are then encouraged to submit your package. And within about 120 days, you will get your first trilateral meeting. EMA and FDA will possibly and are allowed to have bilateral meetings prior to or after the trilateral meeting, just to make sure that the dialogue is ongoing. And as I said, it is in an effort for us to converge our responses. I would highly recommend that everyone here on the panel, the 391 people right now, to just go on Google for a quick second, say OGD Global Affairs, and you will find our webpage, and in it is the PSA program. It is a very thorough guideline of the email contacts and the timelines, and it is a very helpful resource.
Yeah, thank you. Is there any waiver for BE study for particular type of OGD?
Oh, there are numerous. There are numerous types, depending on the product and depending on the PSGs that are published. And as I mentioned, PSGs are constantly being addressed and scientifically refined to make sure that we are always making regulatory decisions based on sound, solid scientific data. So yes, there are numerous situations.
Yeah, there's another question. It is known that the variability observed in vitro during dissolution testing is way lower than in vivo during clinical testing. Then the relevance to apply the same regulatory expectations to in vitro studies compared to in vivo studies, even if generic approval is based on in vitro solely.
So that's a very tricky question, because so let's first start with saying that in vitro assessment and dissolution testing that are for quality control assessments are part of Office of Pharmaceutical Quality, not Office of Generic Drugs. Now, is in vitro dissolution sometimes used instead of doing bioequivalent studies? It really depends on the class of the product. Because if there are certain if it's a class 1 product, does the solution really have an indication of the in vivo performance? No, but the drug substance characteristics themselves, you can, if the dosage form is disintegrating, then you are going to assume that it's going to be bioavailable, and therefore you can link. So it's not that we use in vitro dissolution to support in vivo performance universally. This is based on very specific class of products. And maybe a good time to also read ICHM 9 to kind of guide you through, when can you have certain biowaivers under what conditions. But as a general statement, dissolution testing is not used instead of to support bioequivalence unless it is scientifically justified based on the characteristics of the drug substance as well as the dosage form.
Thank you. Are the same innovative products in different global jurisdictions considered bioequivalent?
So I think the question that you're referring to is the reference standards, right? Would the FDA consider a product, a new drug application or a brand product approved in a different jurisdiction as equivalent to an FDA approved product? Based on our statutory, the answer is no. FDA considers an RLD or a reference standard only based on it being approved by the FDA. Now,
Okay.
that is a regulatory and statutory requirement.
Yes, thank you. US and EMA bioequivalence requirements are different. In US, biowaiver criteria is different in fixed dose combination product, and in EU it is different. So how it will work in PSA?
That's a great question. I recommend, so in a PSA, as we mentioned, we do acknowledge that our regulations are different. PSA program is not established to change regulations or such statutory requirements. It is aimed to guide industry in the best practices and approach in the pharmaceutical development process, given that we are quite aware of our divergent requirements. How will that work is, as I mentioned, we will try to converge our responses. However, we do recognize that if they are divergent, the applicant will know quite well the reasons behind the divergence and will have a separate response from each agency. But I always encourage people thinking, well, I'm not going to get a convergent response anyway, as you have the opportunity to sit with both regulators at the same time and get a response to your question during your development process, completely removing the obstacle of having to conduct studies that may not add value when you are submitting your application to either agency.
Thank you. Are there harmonization processes in progress, not only for generics, but also for hybrid or well-established products?
Are we referring to EMA's definition of hybrid?
Right.
Or are we referring to...
They like to know the harmonization process, whether it is other than generic also in progress or not.
Oh, there are numerous. And in fact, if you visit ICH webpage, you will see how many quality-related guidances that are currently being addressed and developed. So there are numerous approaches. I know there was a lot of focus on highly critical topics, but I encourage you to visit ICH. ICH M13 is the first solely generic drug development harmonization guidance. However, there are others that are constantly being developed and coming up in the pipeline as well.
Okay, thank you. Is there an international or global regulatory body that could be notified if there is any potential high risk of using a particular drug is observed, which information could be shared globally?
That's a great question. Are we referring, and let me just clarify the question, are we referring to safety concerns related to the use of a product, or is this more of an informant concern related to manufacturing malpractice and
it's more on a safety of the product?
So safety of the product, there are a number of ways, right? There's the FDA has the MedWatch program and the FARS websites that allow patients, caregivers, healthcare professionals, as well as industry, and actually industry is obligated to do so in reporting what an FDA registered product, if there are any safety concerns or lack of efficacy. We do share safety notifications or safety concerns or reports with other regulators under other clusters that are established between FDA and other regulators. So there is a dialogue. There's also a method by which, if this is not an FDA approved product and there is a safety concern, there's a method to do so through WHO.
Yes. Now they like to know whether any process, mutual recognition process in progress with the Indian government or Indian regulatory body, since there are plenty of APIs and formulations are imported to US.
It's a great question. And as I mentioned, we have different mechanisms of communicating with other regulators. If you do not know, FDA has an international office in India that has a number of FDA employees that are positioned within the international office located in New Delhi, I believe. And they are a point of contact, and continuous dialogue occurs between the international office in India as well as the Indian healthcare authorities. And I also encourage you to visit OGPS FDA's webpage to learn more about the interactions that occur on a constant basis between FDA and Indian health authorities.
Yeah, thank you. Whether the first generic application stops other sponsors from working on generating it due to exclusivity?
You are not stopped from working on development. Access to market is where FDA really does come into play. If you're a first generic, you're granted a certain period of time, after which access to market of other applicants will occur. It does not dismiss you from developing. It will only hold or hinder your access to market until the allocated time. And remember, the first generic exclusivity period was done to incentivize generic drug industry to access that market.
Okay. Are the same innovative products in different global jurisdictions considered bioequivalent?
So the answer is, from an FDA's perspective, what we consider is what has been approved by the FDA. We cannot, based on the statutory and regulations, consider a product approved in another jurisdiction to be equivalent to a product in the US.
Okay, thank you. I think I have covered most of the questions. Matthew, can you see if I missed anything? I'll just run through it again and see if I missed any, because maybe one or two.
Well, if there are more questions, I suppose they can email to Sarah.
Absolutely.
Yes.
And she may answer them, depending upon her time.
Yeah, Matthew, you can take over now.
Okay. Well, we are almost at the end of the hour. So I want to give a huge thank you to Sarah. This has been one of the most informative presentations I have ever seen on this topic. So Sarah, thank you very, very much on behalf of FIP. We look forward to more interactions like this. And Kaushik joins me in thanking all the attendees. As was announced earlier, everybody who signed in using Zoom will get a certificate of attendance early next week. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thank you, Sarah. Thanks.
Have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.